Stop embarrassing us, Mother. Sit down. Michael's shout ripped through the air, shattering the cheerful buzz of the 70th birthday party. The music stopped mid-beat, and half-finished laughter died instantly. Every eye turned toward the silver-haired woman standing by the table, her hand trembling as she held a glass of wine. Ruth froze. The smile that had barely formed on her lips turned to stone. Her frail fingers failed to hold the glass, and it slipped from her hand, crashing against the tiled floor. The sharp crack of shattering glass cut through the room like a knife to the heart. For a moment, silence swallowed everything. Some people looked away, others whispered under their breath. Ruth stood there, alone, her eyes glistening, her heart aching. The mother who had spent a lifetime raising her son, sacrificing everything for him, was now treated as nothing more than a disgrace in front of everyone. Have you ever felt the sting of being humiliated in public by the very child you love most? Share your thoughts in the comments and hit follow now, because what happened after this moment was 100 times more shocking and painful. Ruth sat quietly in her small room, the warm glow of an old table lamp spilling across a face lined with deep wrinkles. At 70, she was no longer the lively woman she once had been. The same hands that once glided effortlessly across chalkboards now trembled even as she lifted a glass of water. Her life had only ever had one true source of pride, her only son, Michael. When her husband died in a car accident, Ruth was just past 30. Standing before his photo, clutching her tiny son against her chest, she whispered a vow. Don't worry. No matter how hard it gets, he will grow up with everything he needs. From that day forward, Ruth carried the burden of being both mother and father. By day, she was a smiling elementary school teacher, hiding her fatigue behind gentle patience. By night, after her students had gone home, she tutored for extra money, hunched over stacks of papers and tests. Sometimes, just to pay Michael's tuition, she sold her only motorbike and walked more than a mile to school. Friends and colleagues urged her to think of herself, but Ruth always replied with the same quiet smile. What could be more important than my child? In their little suburban home, she saved every coin to make sure Michael never lacked books or supplies, never felt lesser than his classmates. She refused to buy herself new shoes, wearing the same patched sweater through countless winters, just so she could buy him a crisp new uniform for the first day of school. Neighbors often whispered, "She's made of steel, she'll endure anything, as long as her son has a chance to succeed." Ruth was never wealthy, but her love for Michael was priceless. At night, after he fell asleep, she often sat by the window and opened a small wooden box. Inside were old photographs and little notes Michael had written in childhood, scrawled letters that said, "Mom, I love you more than anyone in the world." Those words had once been the fire that carried her through the loneliness of youth and middle age. But time marched on. Ruth grew old. Her health began to fail. And she started to notice that Michael's eyes no longer lit up at the sight of her. Instead, there was busyness, distance, and at times even a flicker of irritation. Ruth told herself, "He's grown up now. He has his own family. That's how it should be." Yet deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slowly, painfully changing. As a little boy, Michael was gentle, his wide eyes always sparkling with innocence. Neighbors often said, "Such a good boy, just like his mother." He's bound to grow into a fine man. Each time Ruth heard those words, pride swelled in her heart. She believed that all her sacrifices would one day be repaid with a devoted, grateful son. On warm summer afternoons, Ruth would sit on the creaky wooden chair outside their porch. Michael would come running, holding out a wildflower he had just picked from the fields. "Here, Mom, this is for you. Someday I'll give you so many flowers, more than you can hold." Ruth pulled him into her arms, her tears glistening under the golden sunlight. Just hearing those words was enough to wash away every ounce of her exhaustion. During holidays, when other children received toys from their parents, Michael usually got nothing more than an old comic book or a simple set of clothes. But he never complained. Instead, he would smile and reassure her, "I don't need much, Mom." Having you is enough. Those innocent words were etched deeply into Ruth's heart, proof that her son would always cherish their bond. One rainy evening, Ruth came home soaked after tutoring late. She found Michael at his desk, hiding a small piece of paper behind his back. After some gentle coaxing, he reluctantly handed it over, blushing. On it, in messy handwriting, were the words, "I promise when I grow up, I'll buy you a big house so you'll never be tired again. I'll never leave you, Mom." Ruth folded that note and placed it in her wooden box like a priceless treasure. Whenever exhaustion threatened to break her, she would take it out and read it, as if it were medicine for her soul. Those childish promises had carried her for years, giving her faith that Michael would always be her anchor, the one person who would never turn away. But as Michael grew older, everything began to change. First came college, then the demands of a steady job. Phone calls grew less frequent, family dinners became rare, and when he married a woman from a wealthy family, the distance between them widened into a gulf. The bright-eyed boy who once swore he'd never abandon her now looked at her with indifference, and at times, even irritation. Ruth reminded herself over and over, "He's busy, he has his own family now, I must understand." But each time she opened the wooden box and read those old letters, her heart ached. "Michael, you once promised you'd never leave me, but now, have you forgotten everything?" After that humiliating birthday, Ruth withdrew quietly into her small suburban home. She looked around at the worn walls, walls that had once echoed with Michael's childhood laughter. Now, the only sounds were the ticking of a clock and the wind seeping through the cracks in the door. Yet in her mind, memories of her son's gradual change replayed like a slow-motion film. It all began the day Michael married Anna, a young woman from a wealthy family. On their first visit, Ruth tried her very best to make a good impression. She prepared a neat table, wore her cleanest dress, and cooked Michael's favorite roasted chicken from his childhood. But Anna barely touched the food, forcing a polite smile before setting her chopsticks down. Michael said nothing, his eyes distant, no longer lit with the familiar excitement when his mother cooked. From that day on, Ruth felt the distance grow. Before, Michael would visit every weekend, helping her in the garden, sharing meals, talking about work. But after the wedding, excuses piled up. "I have a meeting with clients," or "Anna wants a weekend getaway." Sometimes it was simply, "I'm tired, Mom. Please understand." Ruth never complained. She told herself her son was grown, with a family of his own, and that his wife deserved priority. But deep inside, a hollow space widened. Long conversations were replaced with brief phone calls. Once Ruth rang Michael only for him to silence the call, replying days later with nothing more than, "Mom, I've been busy. Don't worry about me." Over time, the change wasn't just in distance, it was in attitude. When Ruth visited, Anna greeted her politely, but Michael's eyes often carried a shadow of annoyance. One afternoon, Ruth accidentally brushed against a crystal vase in their living room. Michael frowned and warned, "Be careful, Mom. That's expensive." The words seemed harmless, but to Ruth, they pierced like a blade. When had her son started valuing material things more than his mother's hands? Soon, Ruth noticed Michael hardly spoke of his childhood anymore. Once, he proudly told friends how his mother had sacrificed everything to raise him. Now, in Anna's presence, those memories vanished, replaced by stories of his career or the wealth of his wife's family. Ruth sat quietly in the corner, her heart aching at the thought. "Does my presence embarrass you now?" One moment in particular broke her deeply. When Michael and Anna hosted a housewarming in their luxurious new apartment, Ruth arrived with a simple handmade gift, a hand-embroidered cloth she had spent weeks preparing. Michael accepted it with a faint smile, almost dismissive, before moving on. Meanwhile, lavish gifts from Anna's wealthy friends were praised and displayed with pride. Ruth noticed everything but masked her tears with a quiet smile. And so, piece by piece, every small detail, every indifferent gesture formed a dark picture. Ruth dared not blame her son, nor resent Anna. Instead, she told herself, maybe I really am old. To the young, the elderly are nothing but a burden. Yet her mother's heart bled with every beat, remembering the little boy who once promised he'd never leave her, now a stranger so far away. In the days that followed, Ruth began to realize the change wasn't just emotional distance anymore. It was starting to reveal itself as something far darker, ambition, wrapped in material greed. Michael was no longer just avoiding her or acting cold. Now he came with requests, though they sounded more like sweetened commands. One afternoon, after weeks of silence, Michael showed up at Ruth's house. Overjoyed, she rushed to warm the best food she had left in the fridge, carefully setting it out on the table. But before she could serve it, Michael slid a thick folder across to her. "Mom," he began smoothly, "I've been thinking, this house is old, and it's not really convenient for you to live here alone. I think you should sign it over to me so I can handle the paperwork. Once I renovate it, you'll have a better place to stay." Ruth froze, staring at him as her heart clenched. This wasn't just a house, it was the place where she had built a life with her husband, where Michael had grown up. Every crack in the wall, every faded tile held memories, and now her son was speaking of it like it was nothing more than an investment. "Michael, this house holds your father's memory. I want to keep it," Ruth replied, her voice trembling. Michael frowned, a flicker of irritation flashing in his eyes. "Mom, you need to think bigger. I run a business. I need assets to secure loans and expand. This isn't just for me, it's for the future. You're old now. You don't need property anymore." Each word stabbed deeper into Ruth's heart. She remembered bitter winter nights spent grading papers by a leaking roof, scraping together every cent to keep the house standing, for Michael's sake, so he'd always have a home. Now the son she sacrificed everything for was treating it like a pawn to trade for his own success. From that day forward, Michael returned often, armed with new arguments. Sometimes he suggested she sell the house and move into a comfortable senior residence. Other times, he painted rosy pictures of how much better her life would be if she agreed. Each refusal from Ruth only darkened his face, as if she were blocking his path to glory. One evening, the shouting grew so loud it spilled out into the street. Neighbors heard Michael's angry voice booming, "You're so selfish, Mom. Do you even realize how many opportunities I've lost because of you?" Passers-by stopped, their eyes heavy with pity as they glanced toward Ruth's door. Someone muttered under their breath, "How could a son speak to his mother like that?" Ruth heard it all, and for the first time, her frail hands trembled as she picked up her old phone and quietly pressed record. She had no wish to harm her son, but deep inside, she knew she needed something, some protection, in case things went further. That night, after Michael stormed out in fury, Ruth sat alone in the darkened house. The wooden box lay open on the table, the childish letters inside glowing faintly in the dim light. She picked one up, her hand shaking so badly it slipped to the floor. Tears streamed down her face, blotting the ink into blurred stains. "Michael," she whispered to herself, "you once promised you'd never leave me, and now you're trying to take even this home away. Do you remember any of it at all?" She closed her eyes, but her son's harsh words from earlier echoed in her mind like a verdict. In the darkness, Ruth felt herself shrinking, as if the whole world had turned its back, leaving one frail, old mother to fight against the very child she had given her life for. The tension didn't stop at the times Michael forced her to sign over the house. With each passing day, Ruth could feel more clearly that her very presence was becoming a burden to him. At parties, gatherings with friends, or even family reunions, Ruth was rarely invited anymore. And when she was, it was only to sit silently in the corner, unnoticed, like a shadow. One afternoon, Ruth pushed herself to visit Michael's new apartment, carrying a basket of fruit she had picked from her garden. She thought her son might smile at the sight of the fresh oranges and apples she had tended with such care. But as soon as she set the basket on the table, Michael glanced at Anna, his brows furrowing. His voice came cold and sharp, loud enough for her to hear. "Mom, you always bring these little things. They don't really fit in here." The words pierced like a knife. Ruth lowered her head and softly replied, "I just thought you'd like them." You used to love the oranges from my garden. You always said they were the sweetest. Michael stayed silent, turning away, leaving Ruth standing there, alone with the fruit no one wanted. She bit her lip hard, swallowing down her humiliation. The breaking point came at a large family gathering, one she had been invited to only out of courtesy. Ruth sat quietly, listening to everyone chat, forcing a smile whenever someone spoke to her. When she finally rose to say a few words of gratitude for her son's accomplishments, Michael suddenly cut her off. His voice rang out across the room, sharp and clear. "Mom, please stop. Every time you speak, you embarrass me. Can you just sit down and stop making my family look bad in front of everyone?" The room froze. The music kept playing faintly in the background, but the air had turned heavy. Ruth stood rooted to the spot, her hands trembling as she clutched her glass, holding onto it as if it were the last bit of warmth left to her. Her heart clenched, each word from Michael hitting her like a cruel, merciless blow. One of the aunts spoke up, her voice tentative. "Michael, why are you speaking so harshly to your mother?" But Michael only tightened his tone, making no effort to hide his irritation. "You don't understand. She's always complaining, always dragging things out. I've told her so many times, stop embarrassing me." Ruth heard every word. It felt as if every cell in her body had turned to stone. The sweet promises of childhood, the little letters she had kept in that wooden box, every sacrifice she had made, all of it had been reduced to a bitter joke. She didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't cry. Ruth simply gave a small nod, set her glass down, and quietly stepped back toward the far end of the room. In that moment, her eyes held a deep, immeasurable sorrow, but also a strange, steady calm. The kind of calm only someone who has endured too much pain could carry. The guests looked on, some pitying, some uncomfortable. But for Ruth, their gazes meant nothing. Inside her, the pain had reached its limit. Her only son, the man she had once believed would be her anchor in old age, now stood before everyone treating his own mother as nothing but a shame. That night, back in her small house, Ruth sat before the wooden box, her fingers trembling as they traced over the faded letters. She whispered hoarsely, "Michael, you once promised you'd never leave me, but tonight I've truly lost you." Outside, the autumn wind howled through the cracks, seeping into her bones, and in the darkness, Michael's harsh words echoed again and again in her mind, carving themselves into a wound that would never heal. Not long after Michael's birthday, the extended family gathered at his wife's family's mansion. The grand living room glowed under bright chandeliers, with a long white tablecloth spread across a banquet table laden with luxurious dishes. Laughter and chatter filled the air until Ruth walked in, and the room seemed to dip into silence for just a moment. She wore a faded lavender dress, clutching tightly to a small wooden box. Inside were the letters Michael had written as a child, the treasure she had guarded for years. Tonight, she hadn't come to accuse or to scold. She only wanted her son to remember the love of the past. She hoped that in front of so many witnesses, his heart might soften. As the evening wound down, Ruth rose to her feet, her voice trembling but steady with resolve. "Excuse me, everyone. I'd like to read a few lines, words Michael wrote when he was just a boy." The room fell quiet. Some looked curious, others frowned in annoyance. Ruth opened the box, her hands trembling as she pulled out a yellowed letter. Her eyes glistened as she read aloud. "Mom, one day I'll buy you a big house. I'll never leave you." Her shaky voice carried into the heavy silence. A few relatives nodded gently, touched. But Michael suddenly shot to his feet, his face flushed, his eyes blazing with fury. He stormed over, yanking the letter from her hands. His voice thundered across the room. "Enough! How long are you going to put on this act? What's the point of reading this nonsense? To humiliate me in front of everyone?" The atmosphere froze. Whispers rippled through the family. Ruth stood motionless, her hands still tinged with the scent of old paper. She tried to speak, but only managed a frail murmur. I just wanted you to remember." Michael cut her off. crumpling the letter in his fist before throwing it to the floor, his voice laced with contempt. Remember what? Those were just childish words. Stop using the past to chain me down. The crackle of crushed paper echoed like a blade tearing through Ruth's heart. She looked down at the letter that had been her comfort for so many years, now trampled under her son's feet. No one spoke. Some relatives exchanged bewildered glances. Others shook their heads in disappointment, while a few cast Ruth looks of pity. In the suffocating silence, Ruth felt as though her entire world had collapsed. The crumpled letter lay on the floor, motionless against the red carpet, like a stain that could never be erased. Ruth's eyes blurred with tears as she stared at it. The room was frozen in silence, broken only by the faint whispers of relatives too afraid to speak out loud. A distant cousin finally spoke, hesitating. Michael, you shouldn't act this way. She's still your mother, and there's nothing wrong with those words. But Michael snapped around, his eyes blazing. You don't understand. She always drags up the same old stories, making me look bad in front of my wife, in front of her family. I've told her 1,000 times. Anna, Michael's wife, sat nearby, arms crossed, her face unreadable. She didn't utter a word, but her cold, detached gaze made Ruth feel like a stranger in her own son's family. Ruth clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay composed. She took a deep breath, then spoke, not with a trembling voice but with a calm, icy tone, like a winter wind. I never meant to shame you, Michael. I only wanted to remind you once, you said I was your whole world. But if now I'm nothing more than a burden, then I promise I'll never trouble you again. The room went still, as if her words had frozen the air. No tears, no pleas, just a quiet statement, sharp as a blade severing the bond between mother and son. Michael stood rigid, his face flickering with a trace of doubt. But he quickly clenched his fists, turned away, and forced himself to sound firm. Do whatever you want. Just stop embarrassing me. The heaviness in the air was suffocating. Some relatives couldn't even breathe too loudly. An aunt glanced at Ruth with pity, but stayed silent, unwilling to intervene. That complicit silence only deepened Ruth's loneliness. She bent down, picked up the wrinkled paper, and carefully placed it back into the wooden box. The gesture was slow, deliberate, like a farewell. Then Ruth lifted her head, her eyes now glowing with a determination she hadn't shown in years. All right, I understand. From now on, I won't trouble you again. Just one sentence, but it dropped into the room like a stone into water, leaving ripples of silence. Ruth turned and walked away, her heels striking the tile floor with hollow echoes, each step beating like a somber drum in everyone's chest. Some relatives shook their heads, whispering, "Poor woman. Michael's gone too far." But no one stopped her. And so, the image of a silver-haired mother, stooped and fragile, clutching her wooden box as she walked out of the glittering, golden-lit room, abandoned by the very son she had given everything to, etched itself into the memory of everyone present. Outside, Ruth lifted her face toward the night sky, her vision blurred, but her tears no longer fell. In that moment, she understood a cruel truth. If a mother's love becomes nothing more than a burden to her child, then even a mother must learn when it's time to let go. And for anyone witnessing this scene, the emotions would be the same. Anger at Michael and an aching sorrow for Ruth's quiet, dignified heartbreak. After the humiliating family gathering, Ruth sat alone in her old house, her heart in turmoil. Michael's words, "You only make me ashamed," kept echoing in her mind. That night, she stayed awake, reading every letter in the wooden box, then glancing at the power of attorney papers she had once signed over to her son. Her hands trembled, but her eyes burned with resolve. Enough. I can't let my own child treat blood ties like this anymore. The next morning, Ruth quietly went to the bank. Her steps were slow, but each one felt like it pressed down on her own heart. The staff recognized her instantly. A frail old woman with silver hair, sunken eyes, but an unshakable determination. Calmly, Ruth explained, she wanted to revoke every authorization she had given Michael. The process was far from simple. She had to present her ID, answer layers of security questions, and enter an OTP code sent to her cracked old phone. Twice her hands shook so badly she typed it wrong, but at last she pressed in the final digits. Each number was like a blade severing the ties that had bound her to Michael's control. After that, Ruth patiently completed another step, changing her will. This time, she left everything she owned to a charity for orphans. When the lawyer asked, "Are you certain?" "This is a major decision." Ruth smiled softly, her eyes calm. "Those children need love just like Michael once did. But my son now, he's chosen another path." When Ruth signed her name, her handwriting shaky but firm, she felt the weight of years finally lift. For the first time in so long, she was free, no longer shackled by Michael's demands. But it didn't end there. Days later, Michael received notice from the bank. He froze, stunned that all his rights had been revoked. Furious, he sped to Ruth's house, his face twisted with rage. "Mother, why would you do this? Don't you know I need that money for my project? Do you even care about me anymore?" he roared. Ruth sat quietly in her familiar wooden chair, gazing at him as if he were a stranger. Her voice was calm, almost chilling. "I've cared for you my whole life, Michael. Now I have to care for myself." Michael stopped cold, disbelief flashing across his face. He had never seen his mother so resolute. Ruth's faded eyes still burned bright with a fierce dignity. For the first time, Michael wasn't facing a fragile old woman. He was facing a mother reclaiming her self-respect. But instead of backing down, Michael clenched his teeth and spat through his anger. "If that's the choice you've made, then don't blame me for what happens next." There was a sharp glint of calculation in his eyes. Ruth shivered, sensing the storm ahead would be far darker than anything she had faced before. Just as Ruth had feared, a thick envelope arrived at her doorstep a few weeks later. Inside was a court summons and a lawsuit filed under Michael's name. He had hired a high-profile attorney accusing Ruth of no longer being mentally competent, that her decisions to revoke the power of attorney and amend her will were invalid. Her hands trembled as she read each line, her vision blurring. Incompetent. The word struck like a fatal blow. A lifetime devoted to education, to preserving her honor and intellect, now her own son branded her as if she were senile. On her first visit to the law office, Ruth sat hunched in the waiting chair, an old cloth bag resting on her lap. The young lawyer she had turned to, a former student, now a successful professional, approached and bowed his head slightly, his voice warm and steady. "Ms. Ruth, I'll help you. We'll prove your competence in court." For the first time in days, Ruth's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. Inside her cloth bag, she had carefully prepared her savings book, house documents, and even a recording of her heated argument with Michael. She knew each piece of evidence would serve as a weapon, but also as a blade cutting deep into her own heart. Meanwhile, Michael spread rumors relentlessly. He told relatives and neighbors that his mother was old, forgetful, no longer aware of what she's doing. Some believed him, whispering behind Ruth's back with pitying looks. Maybe she really has lost it. Who else would leave their estate to strangers? Each time she overheard, Ruth felt her breath catch in her chest, but she stayed silent. She knew the truth would surface. She only needed to endure until the day of trial. One evening, as Ruth sat by the window reviewing her files, the phone rang. Michael's voice came through, cold as ice. "Mother, this is your last chance. If you withdraw the will change, I'll drop the case. If not, you'll lose everything." Ruth closed her eyes, her heart twisting in pain. But when she spoke, her voice was firm, sharp as steel. "You can take everything, Michael, but you'll never take the truth." There was a long silence on the other end before the call cut off. Ruth sat motionless, one hand resting on the wooden box beside her. In that moment, she understood this fight was no longer about property. It was the final battle for a mother's dignity. Outside, the rain began to pour, the steady patter of raindrops echoing the pounding of Ruth's heart. The real storm was on its way. News of the lawsuit quickly spread beyond the family circle. With his wide connections in the business world, Michael skillfully used the media to spin a different story. An elderly, frail mother, no longer of sound mind, manipulated by outsiders into changing her will, hurting the career of her successful son. The first article appeared on a local news site, featuring a photo of Michael in a sharp suit, his expression solemn. Below, the comments poured in. Poor man, such a devoted son, and his mother has lost her mind like that. Maybe she really was persuaded by someone else. What child would ever want to take from their own mother? Ruth sat in her small house holding the paper so tightly her trembling hands nearly tore it apart. She read the false words again and again, each one squeezing her heart like a vice. She remembered all the sleepless nights grading papers, the long walks to school in the rain, every penny saved so Michael could get an education and a better life. And now, to the world, she was painted as senile, greedy, even foolish. It wasn't just in print. Rumors swirled in real life, too. Neighbors who once respected her now whispered behind her back. She's old. Maybe her mind really is gone. Why else would her own son take her to court? Every step Ruth took to the market down the street felt unbearably heavy. Curious, pitying, even disdainful eyes followed her everywhere. The mother once admired by the entire neighborhood had become a subject of gossip. Meanwhile, Michael put on a show of righteousness. He accepted interviews, his voice choked with feigned emotion. I love my mother, but I need to protect her from those who would take advantage. I just want her to have peace in her old age. The lie played on television over and over. Ruth sat in front of her small screen, watching her son like an actor delivering a flawless performance, lying without even blinking. She clenched her hands tightly, feeling the world turn its back on her. Deep down, she still wanted to believe some shred of conscience remained in Michael, but every word, every action proved otherwise. He was willing to destroy his own mother's reputation as long as it preserved his fortune and his perfect public image. Late at night, Ruth sat alone by the window, listening to the wind howl outside. Her voice rasped as she whispered into the darkness. Michael, don't you know you're killing me a little more each day? The storm of public opinion only grew fiercer. On social media, spliced together clips spread like wildfire. In one video, Ruth was shown sitting alone on a park bench, murmuring to herself with bold text overlaid. Elderly woman unable to control her behavior, at risk of being exploited. The comments poured in, cruel and relentless. No wonder her son took her to court. Leaving her alone would be dangerous. She's probably senile for real. Just look at her. Ruth accidentally saw the clip on her old phone when a neighbor showed it to her. She froze, clutching her chest. She recognized it instantly. That was her the day she'd come back from the market, resting on a bench quietly reciting her shopping list. And yet now the entire community believed she was losing her mind. In the days that followed, Ruth hardly dared step outside. Every knock at the door, every whisper at the gate, made her heart race. A kind neighbor once brought her some food, whispering softly, Miss Ruth, don't take it to heart. We know you're not what they say. But Ruth only gave a faint smile. She knew too well, people's faith is fragile as dust, easily swept away by the winds of public opinion. Meanwhile, Michael doubled down on his smear campaign. Through his lawyer, he staged a press conference, presenting evidence that Ruth had forgotten to sign documents, even lost money at the bank due to confusion. Reporters were invited, cameras rolled, articles were written. Michael stood before the crowd, his face solemn, his eyes gleaming with hidden pride. It breaks my heart, but if I don't protect my mother from those who would exploit her, I have no other choice. Watching the broadcast on her small television, Ruth felt as if her very cells were being torn apart. She never imagined that the same boy who once knelt by her hospital bed, clutching her trembling hand and pleading, Mom, don't leave me, could now stand so calmly before the world and turn her into a senile fool. The pressure of public scorn pushed Ruth to the edge. She realized that if she stayed silent, both her dignity and the truth would be buried forever. One sleepless night, she opened her wooden box and pulled out the recording of her argument with Michael. His voice crackled through the earphones, shouting, demanding the house, accusing his mother of selfishness. Ruth's eyes lit with a spark of resolve. She knew it was time to stop enduring quietly. If Michael chose to destroy her with public opinion, then she would use that same public opinion to reveal the truth. In the flickering glow of her desk lamp, Ruth wrote a letter by hand to the newspaper, enclosing the recording. Her handwriting shook, but each word was firm, cutting away the last remnants of fear. I am not senile. I am only a mother who spent her life raising her son, now falsely accused by that very son. This is the truth. She folded the letter and placed it beside the wooden box. Taking a deep breath, her frail shoulders trembled, but her eyes shone brighter than ever. Outside, the voices of public judgment raged on, but this time, Ruth was ready to face them. The day of the trial arrived under a light drizzle. Ruth wore a faded gray coat, clutching the wooden box tightly against her chest. Each step felt as heavy as stone, yet her eyes burned with a determination she had never shown before. Never in her life had she imagined standing in court, not against strangers, but against her own son. The courtroom was packed. Relatives, neighbors, reporters crowded the benches. Camera flashes lit up the room, capturing every detail. Michael entered with his attorney, dressed in an expensive suit, exuding confidence. As he passed his mother, he didn't spare her a glance. His lips pressed thin, his eyes cold. The proceedings began. Michael's lawyer rose, voice firm and theatrical. Your Honor, my client Michael only wishes to protect his mother, but Mrs. Ruth, due to her advanced age, is no longer of sound mind. She has been manipulated by outsiders into altering her will. We have proof. On the large screen, footage played of Ruth sitting alone on a park bench, murmuring to herself. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Michael sat back, arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The judge turned toward Ruth, stern and measured. Mrs. Ruth, do you have a response? Did you understand what you were doing when you changed your will? Ruth clutched the wooden box tighter, her eyes rimmed red. Her voice trembled, but every word was clear. Your Honor, I am fully aware. Every signature, every decision, I made with a clear mind. No one forced me. I am not senile. I only wanted to keep hold of a little dignity. Michael's lawyer frowned, pouncing on her words. If you are of sound mind, why did neighbors report seeing you forget to lock your door? Forget to turn off your faucet? Are you not concealing the truth about your condition? Ruth fell silent, lips pressed tightly together. She remembered the moments of fatigue, the small lapses of old age, but they were not madness. Still, under so many prying eyes, the words caught in her throat. Michael seized the moment, rising with a voice heavy with feigned emotion. I only want my mother to be cared for. I fear she will be taken advantage of. I don't want to lose her, but I also cannot allow her to destroy my career and my family. His words echoed across the courtroom, moving some to nod in sympathy. For a moment, the tide of opinion tilted squarely in Michael's favor. Ruth sat there, frail arms wrapped around her wooden box, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. In that instant, it seemed the case would end in her defeat. Yet deep in Ruth's eyes, a glimmer remained, the glimmer of a mother who refused to be buried beneath lies. The courtroom was thick with tension as Michael's lawyer presented the property transfer contract. The document looked legitimate enough that many in the gallery nearly believed it at first glance. Michael's attorney stood confidently. Your Honor, this is a notarized contract dated 5 years ago. Mrs. Ruth voluntarily signed it, agreeing to transfer full ownership of the house to her son. This proves that her recent actions are without basis. Whispers rippled through the room. Some shook their heads in dismay. All eyes turned skeptically toward Ruth. Michael lifted his head slightly, pride flashing in his eyes. The judge frowned, his voice stern. Defense counsel, please respond. Ruth's young lawyer rose, eyes sharp with determination. He placed a thick file on the table, voice firm. Your Honor, this contract shows signs of forgery. We requested an independent handwriting analysis prior to the trial. Here are the results. He held up the report, stamped in bright red, and submitted it to the judge. The courtroom fell silent. The handwriting expert was called to the witness stand. He pulled up slides, enlarging the contract on the big screen. Using a laser pointer, he highlighted each detail. This is the signature on the contract. When compared to Mrs. Ruth's authentic signature on her bank documents from the same year, there is an unusual match. Every curve is identical. Such exactness is nearly impossible naturally, as even the same person's signature varies slightly. This indicates a copy and paste forgery. Murmurs spread through the room. Michael sat rigid, fists clenched around the chair arms. The expert continued. Additionally, the ink used in this contract was manufactured in 2022, yet the contract is dated 2018. This proves the document was forged recently. Gasps echoed. Reporters snapped photos, flashes lighting up the room. Ruth sat, tears welling, hands trembling as she clutched her wooden box, feeling as though she had just been pulled back from the abyss. Seizing the moment, Ruth's lawyer stepped forward. Your Honor, this isn't all. We also have witnesses and direct evidence of Michael's coercion. The courtroom door opened. A longtime neighbor entered, small in stature but with a clear voice. I've lived next to Mrs. Ruth for over 20 years. I've heard Michael shout at her, forcing her to sign papers. Once, I even saw him slam the table, yelling, "Sign it now! You're old. What do you need a house for?" Her words struck the audience like arrows. Several of Michael's relatives lowered their heads in shame. Then, Ruth's lawyer revealed the trump card, a USB containing the recording Ruth had kept. Michael's voice filled the courtroom, undeniable. You're too selfish. Do you know how many opportunities I lost because of you? This house needs to be in my name to have value. The recording replayed, leaving Michael pale. He leapt to his feet, shouting, "This is staged! She's trapping me!" The judge slammed his gavel, voice firm. Order! The audio evidence is legitimate and verified. The court accepts it. The courtroom erupted. Applause rang out, despite the judge's call for silence. Ruth wept, not tears of sorrow, but tears of liberation. She gently placed her hand on the old letter in her wooden box, the letter Michael had written as a child. I will never leave you. Her lawyer lifted the letter, presenting it as a reminder to the court. Your Honor, this isn't legal evidence, but it is the truth about a mother-child bond that was betrayed. Please consider the full context in your judgment. The judge studied the files carefully, then struck the gavel. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, the court rules the plaintiff's claim is dismissed. The forged contract will be investigated criminally. Mrs. Ruth's property and rights remain intact. Court adjourned. Applause thundered through the room. Ruth sank into her chair, tears streaming. She had reclaimed not only her home, but also her dignity and honor. Michael hung his head, sweat pouring down. The mask of the dutiful son shattered, revealing a greedy, treacherous man exposed to the light of justice. As the crowd departed, one truth lingered in everyone's heart. The truth may be hidden for a time, but it can never be buried forever. The moment the verdict was announced, public opinion swung wildly. The very newspapers that had once praised Michael now ran headlines exposing him. Young businessman forges documents to seize mother's property. Images of him bowing his head in court, drenched in sweat, spread across social media, becoming a hot topic of conversation. Online forums erupted with condemnation. Truly unfilial. He stole his elderly mother's house. Rich but heartless, what a worthless man. In just one night, the carefully constructed image of the dutiful son Michael had worked so hard to build completely collapsed. Even his wife's family no longer hid behind pretense. Anna's parents, who valued their reputation above all, immediately declared, "We cannot accept a son-in-law accused of unfilial behavior and deceit." Anna, who had once sat coldly as Ruth suffered humiliation, now turned her back first. She packed her belongings, took her child, and returned to her parents' home, leaving Michael alone in the empty apartment. Michael's company also faced turmoil. Partners withdrew investments. Shareholders demanded answers. A critical project lost bank support after the media exposed the forged contract. Calls flooded in, not offers of cooperation, but demands for repayment, contract cancellations, and severed partnerships. He sat in his spacious office, staring at the bare white walls. The phone rang incessantly, yet every call brought only cold voices. "Sorry, we cannot do business with you under these circumstances. You'll have to handle that debt yourself. We don't want to be involved." He raked his hands through his hair, pounding the desk, panic in his eyes. Everything he had once prided himself on, status, money, family, was slipping through his fingers like sand. And the cause? His choice to trample the woman who had loved him unconditionally all his life. Meanwhile, Ruth sat quietly in her small house, listening to the news on her old radio. She felt no joy, no vindication, only a profound, quiet sorrow, like a wound that had finally closed but still oozed. She whispered softly, "Michael, this isn't what I ever wanted." In the weeks following the trial, Michael's life plunged into a downward spiral. Everywhere he went, people pointed and whispered, "Isn't that the son who sued his own mother? Yeah, he stole his mother's house and even forged documents, shameful." At the cafe where he once strode in with his head held high, the owner now greeted him coldly, and customers cast him disdainful glances. Some old friends, once drinking and partying by his side, now avoided him, fearing to be tainted by association. Michael's luxurious apartment, once a symbol of pride, now felt empty. No laughter from Anna, no baby's coos, just him, alone in the cold space, buried under unpaid bills and legal papers. Contracts canceled, partners gone, each loss cutting into his pride like a knife. At night, he often sat alone on the sofa, the TV on, but barely watching. In fitful dreams, Ruth appeared, clutching her wooden box, her eyes blurred with tears as she stared at him in court. Her voice echoed, "You promised you'd never leave me." He would wake in a cold sweat, heart pounding, drenched as if he had been bathed in fear. Meanwhile, Ruth quietly returned to her simple life. Mornings, she tended her garden. Afternoons, she taught neighborhood children to read and write. Visitors came by, eyes full of admiration. "Ms. Ruth is a truly strong mother. Justice has finally been served." She smiled softly, though a trace of sorrow lingered in her eyes. She felt no pleasure in her son's downfall, for deep inside, he remained the only child she had raised with all her heart. Yet she understood. Some cracks, even when forgiven, never fully mend. One evening, Ruth sat on her porch, watching the sunset. She opened the wooden box and pulled out an old, yellowed letter. Her fingers trembled as they traced the childish handwriting. "Mom, you are my whole world." Tears fell again, but this time not from despair, only from a quiet, profound peace. She whispered, "I don't need you to be my whole world anymore. Just remembering that you once promised is enough." Outside, Michael's life continued to crumble piece by piece. But inside the little house, Ruth had begun to reclaim her peace. A peace independent of anyone, even the child who had once betrayed her. In the weeks that followed, Michael seemed like a lost soul. Once a dashing businessman praised by the media, he had become a man in ruin, surviving amidst the wreckage of his life. His company went bankrupt, his family fell apart, friends turned away, everything became a never-ending nightmare. Night after night, Michael tossed and turned, dozing fitfully, only to awaken in the middle of his dreams. In those dreams, he saw Ruth, small, fragile, clutching her wooden box, eyes glistening with tears, turning her back and walking away. Her footsteps were heavy, receding farther and farther. He tried to scream, "Mom, don't leave me," but his voice broke, unheard. And when he awoke, there was only darkness and the pounding of his heart. One afternoon, as the rain poured down, Michael sat silently in his empty apartment, a half-finished bottle of liquor on the table. His phone rang. It was an old friend, only to say sharply, "Don't call me again. It's too much trouble." Michael hung up, his mind blank. In that moment, he realized for the first time that he was completely alone. Regret began to gnaw at him. Memories of his childhood rushed back, the simple meals with salty braised fish, his mother's gentle laughter after long days of labor, the warm embrace she gave whenever he was sick. He remembered the time she carried him in the rain, shivering in her torn raincoat. These memories, buried for years as he chased glittering success, now returned like needles pricking at his conscience. Finally, one evening, Michael decided to seek out his mother. He stood before the old gate of the family home, trembling like a child who had done wrong. And the door was slightly ajar, warm yellow light spilling out. Inside, Ruth sat on a wicker chair, knitting a scarf, her silver hair glowing softly in the light. Michael stepped in, head bowed, voice choking. "Mom, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I've done unforgivable things. I betrayed you. I broke the promises I made. I regret it so much, Mom." Ruth looked up, eyes blurred behind her glasses. She saw the son kneeling before her, crying like a child. Tears streamed down his face, the same face that had once rejected her coldly before so many. She gently set the scarf aside, trembling as she reached out and touched his shoulder. Her voice was deep and sorrowful, like it echoed from the depths. "Michael, I've waited too long for this apology, but forgiveness doesn't mean everything will go back to the way it was." Michael buried his head in his mother's lap, sobbing. "I know. I don't dare ask you to forget. I just want a chance to make things right, to be the son you once trusted again." Ruth remained silent for a long time. In her heart, maternal love still existed, but the scars could not easily fade. She sighed softly, her gaze distant. "I can forgive because you are my blood, but I cannot forget, and I cannot let myself be hurt again." Tears streamed down Michael's face. He understood that his mother's forgiveness was a gift, but also a warning. He had lost the most precious thing, her trust, and to regain it, perhaps his whole life would not be enough. Ruth hugged her son gently, her tears blending with the rain outside. In that moment, mother and son wept together, one for regret, the other for the pain that had been endured for far too long. In the late afternoon, Ruth sat on the porch, the sunset casting a soft golden-orange glow over her little garden. She took a slow sip of tea, the faint scent of lotus stirring memories of her youth. No more tense arguments, no more scrutinizing eyes. Life had finally returned a gentle peace to her. The old house had now become a refuge for the neighborhood children. Every afternoon, they would run over, chattering excitedly, sitting around the wooden table as Ruth taught them to read each letter and write each number carefully. Her frail hands trembled slightly, but her eyes sparkled at the children's innocent laughter. For Ruth, happiness was no longer about honor among relatives or the distant promises of her son. Happiness was simple, to give love and to feel her heart at ease. Yet deep inside, the wound left by Michael still lingered. Some nights, she would wake, remembering the sharp voice at his birthday party. "Stop embarrassing us, Mother. Sit down." Tears would wet her pillow. But unlike before, these tears were no longer despair. They were a form of cleansing, a way for her to learn to let go and lighten her soul. Michael still came by occasionally, his eyes heavy with sadness, his frame weary. He would sit on the porch, silently watching his mother teach, then quietly ask to help with small chores. Ruth did not refuse, but she did not embrace him as she once had. She gave him opportunity, yet maintained a boundary, a necessary line, because love can forgive, but broken trust is hard to restore fully. One day, as Ruth folded old letters back into the wooden box, Michael hesitated and asked, "Mom, why do you still keep them? Doesn't it hurt to look back?" Ruth smiled, her gaze gentle but resolute. "They are more than memories. They remind me of a little boy who once promised he would never leave his mother. And they remind me that even when people change, the love we once shared still holds value." Michael stayed silent, head bowed. He knew his mother's words were both an act of grace and a reminder of the relentless regret he carried. Days passed, and Ruth found joy in small things. She planted more flowers, cared for a stray kitten, and joined a volunteer group to cook meals for the homeless. Every time she saw their grateful eyes, her heart warmed. She realized that love wasn't meant for just one person. It was meant to spread, to heal others, and to heal herself. In the evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ruth often sat watching the sky change colors. Her heart embraced a simple philosophy. Family is not defined by blood but by respect and love. Those who cherish it are worthy of being called family. The story closed in that peaceful scene. Ruth sipped her tea, smiling as she watched the children play in the yard. In her eyes, there was no longer the pain of betrayal, only the serenity of someone who had weathered storms and come to understand the true value of love and freedom. And though Michael continued to struggle to find himself outside, Ruth knew her path had changed. She chose to live gently, without resentment, but also without allowing herself to be hurt again. What would you do if you were in Ruth's shoes? Could you forgive a child who betrayed you, or would you turn away to protect your self-respect? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe, because I promise you the next story will be even more shocking and haunting.